Thank you for joining Dawn's latest event where we hope to deconstruct the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF. We're also going to discuss its impact or lack thereof on the humanitarian situation in Gaza today. For some context, the GHF largely took over the humanitarian response in the Strip on May 26th, following nearly a year and a half of fighting between Israel and Hamas. During that time, Israel regularly and aggressively accused the pre-existing humanitarian response led by the United Nations and major humanitarian aid implementers of both failing in their mission to conduct aid operations while allowing Hamas to siphon aid. Um, Ultimately, it seemed exceedingly clear that both accusations were designed to undermine that system, especially as Israel has not presented serious evidence of aid diversion, which the UN has also denied is systematic or systemic, excuse me, while largely playing into the prime role of blocking aid flows into Gaza in the first place. So while the GHF claims to embody the core principles of humanitarianism, namely impartiality, neutrality, and independence, the reality on the ground reflects something much more sinister. The Israeli and U.S. backed organization appears to be directly working with the IDF, with funding streams now officially coming from the U.S. government and unofficially from the Israeli side. The group operates an extremely limited number of aid locations, forcing Gazans to travel long distances for limited amounts of aid. Oftentimes, there is no aid left for large portions of the Palestinians that do go to these locations, as the operation has failed to meet the needs of the Strip's roughly 2 to 2.3 million people. Meanwhile, the IDF have reportedly killed hundreds of Palestinians and injured thousands more around those sites, claiming threatening movements on the part of starving Palestinians simply gathering around locations ahead of aid distribution. The IDF has largely closed off most of Gaza, including areas around these sites, making them into essentially kill zones. And so with that context, I want to dive into our experts and do some quick introductions before we jump to their opening remarks. First, we have Mohammed Shehada. He was a visiting fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations in the Middle East North Africa program. He's a Gazan researcher, writer, and human rights advocate. His work focuses on investigating human rights violations in Gaza and the West Bank, and more broadly in the Middle East and Europe, with an emphasis on the treatment of migrants, refugees, and civilians in conflict zones. He also serves as the communications and programs director at the Euromed Human Rights Monitor. We also have Stacy Gilbert, a former senior advisor at the U.S. State Department. Stacy is an expert on humanitarian emergency response who served at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, or PRM, for about 20 years before resigning in protest of the Biden administration's Gaza policy last year. We also have Sarah Lee Whitson, executive director of Dawn, an organization that seeks to support democracy and human rights in the Middle East, hold abusers accountable, and reform U.S. policy in the region. Previously, she served as executive director of Human Rights Watch's Middle East and North Africa division from 2004 to 2020. Finally, we have Raed Jarrar, Dawn's advocacy director. He has worked as a lobbyist on political issues pertaining to U.S. engagement in the Arab world since 2005, having testified in numerous congressional hearings and briefings. He's a frequent guest on national and international media outlets in Arabic and English, as well as a writer in many of those outlets as well. He also serves on the advisory board of the organization Air Wars. Okay, so that was a bit of a mouthful, but let's jump right into it. Mohammed, I want to start with you. So if you could please just describe generally the humanitarian situation in Gaza today, particularly focusing on the GHF and the atrocities that have kind of surrounded it, and just anything else you're seeing that is particularly of importance to those subjects today. That could be local gangs in the Strip working with the IDF. I know you wrote an excellent article recently on that subject, as well as maybe just Israel blocking aid. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Alex, for the kind introduction. Well, basically, the easiest way to describe the humanitarian situation is an anecdote. A friend of mine, the son of Holocaust survivors, his mother was once asked on the day she was liberated from Auschwitz if it was the happiest day in her life. And her answer was with complete outrage and contempt. She said, "Happiest? How dare you? It was the worst day in my life because that's when I got the mental energy to process that every single member of my family has been killed." And that's the situation that you got in Gaza with the first ceasefire, the major ceasefire that we had in November for 7 days. And then the second ceasefire that we had this year in late January, right before Trump's inauguration, where you had people just having the mental capacity, suddenly being outside of survival mode and understanding, processing what it means to have lost, like, virtually every single person I know in Gaza had their homes bombed, destroyed, burned to the ground, or damaged to the point that it cannot host any human life in it anymore. And nonetheless, I still have family and friends that are living in the ruins of their destroyed homes. The other dimension is that in Gaza, one of the first questions I ask everybody there, and we ask each other, is how many family members have you lost? The answer is always in the dozens. Personally, I lost about 106. Last time I checked in February this year, so 4 months ago. I couldn't keep account after this, and it was only my father's side of the family. I didn't even dare to check both sides. And basically add to this the most cruel element of Israel's genocide, the starvation that is systematic from day one, with a declared intention that Israel's defense minister laid out, followed by a number of politicians as well. No food, no water, no electricity, no medicine, no fuel into Gaza. And they meant it literally. The only thing that pushed Israel to allow some fractions of food was basically the international pressure, or the fear of international pressure mounting to end the war itself, to end the genocide. So if you look at Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's finance minister, one of the most honest in Netanyahu's cabinet, he said it very openly. He's saying that we are allowing, quote, the very least of the very least to continue the war, to destroy everything that's left of Gaza. Basically, he laid it out even more specifically. He said every single person in Gaza would be, at best, at the very best case scenario, allowed a piece of bread and a bowl of soup per day. And that's the only meal they would get, nothing more. And that basically, if you look up the Gulag concentration camps, you would find that prisoners there got more food, way more food, than Gazans are allowed to receive now. Israel's starvation is not only about restricting the amount of food they allow in to the minimum of the minimum, as Smotrich put it, but it is a multifaceted strategy to maintain the starvation, to sort of bolster it, enhance it as much as possible through a number of indirect ways. It relies on at least 3 or 4 elements. Number one is what you have with these gangs, ISIS-linked mercenaries, criminals. Basically, I have a list of the names of the leaders of those gangs that have been armed, funded, and provided equipment by Israel. And the majority of them are drug dealers, convicted murderers, and members of ISIS. And Israel uses them merely as a front to maintain plausible deniability. They've been using them according to the UN, according to the Red Cross, according to basically any humanitarian organization that's ever worked in Gaza and had boots on the ground. That Israel has been using this group for over a year to systematically loot the aid, the very little amount of aid that they would allow in. The goal is basically to deter those organizations from even trying to pick up the aid in the first place, because their humanitarian workers, the truck drivers, are very afraid for their personal safety and their lives. A number of them have been killed. The largest number of humanitarian workers in modern history, over 300 UNRWA workers alone. Same with truck drivers, almost a dozen killed by those gangs. The other element is basically Israel going after law enforcement authorities, as well as volunteers, emergency committees, municipality workers. Any person in Gaza that tries to maintain a rudimentary level of organized human life is targeted immediately. We've seen an example of this last year in March, where there was something called the Emergency Committee, sort of a group that brings together government employees, civil servants, police officers, volunteers, civil society leaders, representatives of political groups, and large families. That emergency committee managed to get some aid into northern Gaza around, I think, March 16. I remember the date very precisely. They managed for the first time since the start of the genocide to get it all the way to the very north of Gaza without a single incident of looting. Zero, none. Israel's reaction the day after was to invade the headquarters from which that emergency committee operated with Israel's full knowledge, and to destroy, to assassinate, to target systematically every single person that was involved in this apparatus until they brought it down. We then saw them targeting any volunteers, even if they're armed with sticks or if they're not armed at all, that try to prevent the looting. We've seen this yesterday. So some families in Gaza stepped forward and said, we're going to protect the aid trucks. We're going to prevent any looting. And for the first time in months, again, zero incidents of looting, none whatsoever. The aid trucks managed to get to the depots, to the warehouses without a problem. You had Anira for the first time in weeks saying, we managed to deliver all of it. It's in the warehouse. There's organized distribution. There's no chaos. Israel's reaction was today they bombed the volunteers that were part of this, and they announced halting, suspending the entry of food into Gaza. They got very enraged and mad that food was not looted. And that's the last sort of pillar of this Israeli starvation strategy, is to engineer chaos, engineer societal collapse from within, engineer despair, so that people would fight for who can survive, every man for himself kind of mentality, and people would eat each other alive. Basically, the answer to end all of this was very abundantly made clear by Israel itself, incidentally, during the ceasefire that lasted about 42 days, the one that you had right before Trump's inauguration and lasted until early March, where Israel was forced, per the agreement, to allow 600 trucks of food into Gaza, which is the very basic minimum that Gaza needs for survival. Once that minimum was allowed in, all the looting disappeared. Zero. Not a single incident recorded of looting. So Israel now comes up recreating this crisis again for two reasons: maintain the genocide by any means possible, and number two, to use that starvation as leverage to debilitate the general population, to pin them against each other until they capitulate. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Mohammed. Very, very interesting points, and especially the recent decision by the Israeli government on aid. It's really important. It's new as of today, from my understanding. And I believe we might have some folks from Anira actually in the audience, so I would welcome them later to use the Q&A function and join us in the conversation if they have anything to add on that front. So now we're going to jump over to Stacy. So given your extensive experience inside the U.S. government, I wanted to ask you about your views of the GHF. Alongside that, I wanted to ask you about the U.S. decision to fund the GHF, which was announced a couple of days ago, maybe yesterday. It's apparently what we've seen in reporting, a bit of an opaque decision process, but falling outside of the normal contracting and review process. So I'm just hoping for, kind of your take on that overall situation, as well as also your kind of view of the humanitarian situation and the GHF in Gaza. Thank you. I'm sorry, Stacy. I think your audio is something's wrong. There's static, but then there's your voice is not really coming through.
Thanks. So, according to the State Department spokesperson 2 days ago, can you hear me now?
Yeah. Sorry, there might be a slight delay, Stacy. You go ahead.
My system seems to be a little sluggish. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there might be a delay. Maybe try with your video off.
Let me try again.
Stacy, we hear you fine.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
I will go off video. You see me now, now you don't. Hopefully you'll continue to hear me.
All right. Yeah, no, it's coming through fine
Hear me now.
Thank you.
Okay, my video is off. I will go on. Hopefully that resolves the bandwidth issues. So as of 2 days ago, okay. As of 2 days ago, the State Department spokesperson, Tammy Bruce, said she knew nothing about U.S. government support. She didn't know where GHF was getting their money, which it would not be the first time the State Department spokesperson lied from the podium. In terms of U.S. government funding for humanitarian organizations, any humanitarian organization will know, it is a long and involved process. Specific processes they go through, but all U.S. government agencies have to ensure that the organizations that they are funding have the ability to monitor their programs and also have the ability to conduct monitoring for their fiscal responsibility. For humanitarian organizations, they need to be a 501c3 according to the IRS criteria. But they also have to ensure that none of their funding or services or resources go to terrorist organizations. So there is a lot of there's actually a lot of oversight for those organizations, but in an emergency, there are ways to try to get the funding out much quicker, because this is at best a several week process to expedite funding. But it would be very, very unusual to expedite funding to an organization that is new and unknown to the U.S. government, which GHF certainly is. According to the very extensive reporting the Washington Post has done on this and digging into their establishment documents, the first paperwork for this organization was in November 2024. So established in Wilmington, Delaware. And then there was some additional founding documents to establish it as an NGO in Switzerland, but that was rescinded when the humanitarian community rightly raised questions about what it was doing and whether it would adhere to humanitarian standards as a so-called humanitarian organization. Anyway, it would be, the U.S. government has ways to do funding in emergency situations. One would be sole source, and there's criteria, and there would have to be documentation to say, for the U.S. government's objective, this is the only organization that can provide those goods or services. So that would need to be documented, and it is very unclear, considering, at least formally from the podium, the State Department is denying knowing or funding this organization. But like I said, there are ways for the U.S. government, at least in the past, before this administration, there were ways to move funding quickly, but that would have to be to an organization that was known to the United States and actually had a track record. We absolutely don't see that in this situation. So much about this organization is unknown, and we're only finding about from contractors who've worked for it or people involved in the planning who've resigned. So this does not bode well for the transparency that this administration seems to be very keen on enforcing. Over.
Thanks, Stacy. And I guess just a quick follow-up on that. Looking at the GHF as we understand it, and again, it's a very opaque organization, but we have seen the setup in the Strip. Your experience at PRM, is this a normal aid operation? Is this something that you would deem as effective? Would you deem this something that would be acceptable for the U.S. to fund as a humanitarian operation?
In all my years of working at the State Department in large-scale humanitarian emergencies, I have never seen the State Department or even from the outside USAID fund something like this. This may be something intelligence agencies or DoD does. This is not something I have seen the State Department do. Like I said, there is a way for the State Department and USAID to fund a humanitarian organization quickly, but that is not this. And this goes back to predating when GHF came into the public eye in mid-May as an alternative to the existing aid organizations and as a way to, that there had been an 11-week blockade by Israel of all assistance into Gaza, and this was supposed to be the way, the acceptable way to Israel to get assistance in. But predating that, this goes back to Israel's stated purpose to wrest control from internationally accepted humanitarian organizations. That has long been their goal, both in terms of cutting, insisting that it not work with UNRWA, basically making working with UNRWA illegal. This is all part of a larger plan that Israel seems to be executing, which is starving Gazans, not allowing humanitarian aid organizations to provide resources or protection or assistance. And what we can also see, obviously, it seems to have the impact of trying to displace people to southern Gaza, which has also been a stated military objective of the IDF. Over.
Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight kind of especially that the U.S. government kind of typical approach to working with humanitarian groups versus what this is, which is clearly very much outside of the box, and not normal. Before we jump over to Sarah Lee, I just want to remind everyone we do have a Q&A function. We very strongly encourage questions, even comments from our audience. For either our panelists or, again, if you just have something you'd like to say, we would definitely welcome that as well, and we can allow you to speak. Okay, so Sarah Lee, we want to turn over to you now to just kind of generally discuss what's going on in Gaza, the humanitarian situation as well. You may perhaps Dawn's stance on the humanitarian response, whatever else you would like to share. Thank you. Oh, you're still muted.
Yeah, thanks. And if my audio is wobbly, I'll also turn my camera off. So just let me know. I just want to follow up on Stacy's comments because I think they provide a very important political context for what we're seeing. The analysis of what's happening in terms of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's effectiveness or delivery is really practically tangential to an assessment of what Israel's goals are in bringing in this made-up new organization and the dangers that it poses, not just to the starving people of Gaza, but more broadly speaking in terms of the militarization of humanitarian assistance, really violating the most basic precept of why humanitarian assistance is permitted in a time of war, why humanitarian aid organizations are expected, are demanded, must be perceived to be independent and politically neutral. And what this the various goals that are being achieved as part of the rollout of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. I think as Stacy pointed out, and as I think everyone in the world with eyes and ears can see, Israel's goal from the very beginning has been to starve the Palestinian population. And this is not even a new plan. Since 2006, there's been a complete blockade and closure of Gaza, with the Israeli government's stated intent of putting Palestinians in Gaza on a diet. So playing with food distribution, calorie distribution in Gaza, controlling the access of people of Gaza to water, to electricity, to be able to operate basic machinery, agriculture, the destruction of agricultural lands is part of the long-term strategy of Israel to make Gaza uninhabitable. And that has now been put on steroids during this war, where Israel believes that victory is at hand. It's very at hand that the people of Gaza will either all start to die in even greater numbers, given the months and months and months of deprivation of food and medicine, water and electricity, housing that they're experiencing, and that the international community will put enough pressure on Egypt, as well as other countries in the world, to take the population of Gaza that remains. That is their goal. And now, in creating this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, they are one step closer to that, because they have effectively eliminated the actually independent humanitarian aid organizations that have been operating in Gaza, not just since the war, but for the past several decades, that have been able to deliver medicine and food to the population, namely UNRWA, but others as well. I mean, there are other UN agencies that have been involved in Gaza. There are private organizations that have been involved in Gaza, including ANERA. And so by eliminating these organizations, they have sought to eliminate the one sort of separate channel of aid, independent aid, that has been circumventing what are Israeli policies to starve the Palestinian population of Gaza. More broadly speaking, I think there is, this ties into, and why we have seen it succeed, as in succeed in becoming established and succeed in being used as a political military weapon to starve and punish the civilian population in Gaza, is it fits into the ideology and mindset of many in the Trump administration, and probably many beyond, that see independent aid organizations, particularly UN aid organizations, as entities that need to be privatized, as entities that they cannot control, as entities that are effectively subverting their political military goals because they operate independently. And so the notion of attacking the UN and UNRWA fits into the Trump administration's goal, not only in terms of supporting whatever Israel wants in Gaza, but more broadly to bring these independent United Nations entities and agencies to their knees, to stop them from being the eyes and ears of the world when journalists can't report. I mean, so much of our information has come from aid workers and doctors in Gaza, but also in war zones around the world. Why this is so dangerous and risky legally, and I agree with every word of the letter that was sent by 15 human rights and humanitarian aid agencies recently to the United States and to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, warning them of complicity in war crimes, is that it subverts the purpose of humanitarian aid groups around the world. It subverts the principle of aid neutrality around the world, and will quickly become the norm in other conflict zones around the world. I mean, what's to stop any other regime from saying, nope, we're not going to allow international aid organizations. We're going to create our own. We're going to finance it through our own means. And it's going to do what we say. And of course, we see very clearly how that's being used, weaponized specifically in Gaza, in what are now described as death camps, these 4 so-called distribution hubs that have actually been the site of reportedly up to 400 killings of Palestinians since the aid launched. I'll pause there, and Alex, I'm happy later to return to some of the international law provisions governing the protection of humanitarian aid and aid workers, but I suspect I've spoken too long, so I'll pause here.
No, that was great, Sarah Lee. And I think it's incredibly important, especially to raise the eyes and ears component. It goes beyond humanitarianism. The UN and humanitarian implementers see these things and they report these things. And that's incredibly important. There's a reason why journalists are not allowed into Gaza unless they're with the IDF, right? It's an extension of that, essentially. Okay, so I want to jump back to Mohammed really quickly with just a follow-up before we go to our Q&A. So one thing that we've seen repeatedly with these GHF sites is that, as folks gather and prepare to go into the sites, that's when you tend to see, these claims of threatening approaches to IDF positions, right? Um, People are gathering to get food because there's not enough. That's realistically what's happening here. But um, some people describe this as like a Hunger Games almost situation, which is horrifying. Mohammed, can you just explain that situation? Maybe I imagine you've talked with Gazans that have gone through this experience. Kind of just go into that a little bit more for us, please.
Yeah, well, Hunger Games is one precise way of putting it. Squid Games as well, Mad Max, Minority Reports, Fallout, all those like horror movies bundled together quite literally because you have the sci-fi horror show with Israeli drones and high-tech and facial recognition going on, checkpoints and military remote automated killing machines, and then you've got the whole apparatus that is in place to pin people against each other happening in like basically a desert surrounded by sand dunes. And every day, the way the massacres unfold is GHF is located in the very south of Gaza, and one after the heavily militarized Netzarim corridor in the very center of Gaza. So people in the south, for instance, would walk for dozens of kilometers, a journey that would take at least 8 hours on foot, and sit there, camp, literally sleep on the beach overnight at an area called Muawiyah Mosque. It's close to the flag square, the earliest or the closest point to GHF that people are allowed to. And people would sleep there on the street in the night. And around 2 past midnight, they would start waking up and getting ready for the journey. There would be a buildup of more people arriving. And as soon as there is a buildup, naturally, you have a giant population that's crowding at that point. They will try to find their way into the GHF distribution centers. So as soon as that happens, the IDF would claim we detected, quote, unauthorized movement, or we felt threatened, unsafe, unloved, unhappy. And then they empty machine guns into them, mow them down, gun them down immediately. We've seen also using artillery fire, gunboats firing at people, drones, and even airstrikes at starving crowds that Israel itself, the GHF, which is, according to Israeli opposition leaders, is just an Israeli front. It's basically a sham that Israel founded to institutionalize the starvation. So GHF every day, it gets about 20 trucks of food. 20. Gaza needs 600. 20 would be the equivalent of giving each Gazan around 150 grams of food per day. In the Gulag concentration camps, people used to get about 1,100 grams of food per day. So you give Gazans about 10 to 15% of a Gulag camp, concentration camp inmate. So basically, once you got people stampeding in the morning, that's the first massacre. Then the IDF would open the way and allow them in. They would go in and find that these gangs that the IDF supports have been there already and looted all the most valuable stuff. So, for instance, sugar. A single bag of sugar at the moment in Gaza costs something, 1 kilo of sugar. It costs something about like $50 to $100. They would also loot oil. They would loot anything of value and leave. People arrive first in waves. The first wave, they would take whatever they find. Then the second wave would arrive and they would find that there's almost no more food left. They would find the scraps. That's when you see the footage of old women and children and basically emaciated civilians on the floor trying to sift through sand to find pasta screws or to find wheat flour or rice that fell from other people's bags. And then there's the third wave that arrives at the end of the day, basically around noon or the afternoon, and they are told, go back or we will fire immediately. There's no food left. But for a person that walked dozens of kilometers on foot without any food back home, they literally have no physical energy to walk back and wait to start the cycle the day after. So you see people refusing and begging for any scraps that are left there, and then the IDF fires again. Throughout these three waves, every time there is a buildup of people, because the distribution centers would provide maximum food for about 12,000 people per day. Best case scenario, let's say 20,000 out of 2.4 million people that are caged in Gaza. And once you get a buildup of people more than what the IDF had determined without telling any criteria, without sort of messaging that criteria, then the IDF starts firing as well. They would claim, okay, there is now a stampede of people. The number of people there is higher than what we authorized it to be. And they would start gunning them down over and over again. So that's why, like, I was looking at the numbers of casualties on Tuesday while I was at a workshop. And in the morning, first time I opened my phone, it's like the stock exchange. It's going up, 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 up. And each time it takes a massive jump. It's almost like Bitcoin. So basically it started with about like 39 killed or 37 people killed in Gaza. 29 of them were killed at the GHF distribution centers. And then an hour later, I refreshed, it jumped to 55. I refreshed more. By the end of the day, the number exceeded 100 killed in Gaza. Right now, Israel reached a stage where the overwhelming majority of people killed in Gaza are not killed in airstrikes, are not targeted, are not killed in IDF raids or operations. They are just starving people at the distribution centers. So Israel, it's not even there by accident. It is there by design. If you want to maintain a policy of starvation against 2.4 million people and get away with it, the only way you can do it is to pretend to allow food to go in and then create a massive deterrent for anyone with a sane mind to try to get that food in the first place. It's like one of those horror bedtime stories that we read in our childhood, like Hansel and Gretel, where you just lace food with poison, or you try to lure people with crumbs of food to their certain death. And that's the situation you have at hand right now. So that's why the majority of people in Gaza are even too scared to make the journey. And one thing about death by starvation in Gaza is that it does not make it in the official count of casualties of war. It's considered an indirect death. Most of the times, families wouldn't even report it. Because if you got someone dying in a family from starvation, chances 100% chance the rest of the family are starving as well, with no means to get out and ask for help, or no means to get to a hospital and report the death. So that's why we see this massive iceberg that is hidden from our view of people being starved to death very slowly as a genocidal tactic.
Yes, very, very important points. And I think, it's important to note that the GHF continues to say that, chaos is not happening at the sites when it very clearly is. We see this on a daily basis in our social media feeds and in the news, and not enough in the news, but we have seen reports on this, right? And so it's important to note that, the system, as you said, structurally is designed to create chaos and cause problems and starve people. Okay, I want to jump to the Q&A. We do have a question related to kind of what I had just asked you, Mohammed, although I will open this up to everyone. Essentially, the question is, we have seen these shootings around the GHF sites. UN Human Rights Office has called for investigations, but we have not really we've seen pushes towards justice, but we have not seen real accountability. So what does real accountability look like with this surrounding this GHF system, when you are seeing coordination with the IDF, you are seeing coordination with local gangs? Both of those entities are shooting innocent people, and this is part of a broader, as it would seem at least, starvation campaign. That starvation campaign sits at the core, right, of the ICJ genocide case. What does accountability look like now or in the long term? And maybe perhaps even how do we get there? I pose this to anyone in the group. I know it's a difficult question, but
this is Stacy. I'll jump in on that. I think the minimum that has to happen is the funding and the funding and the basic information about this group has to be public. If the United States government is funding this as a humanitarian operation, it has to be transparent about it. No leaking documents. Let's be honest. Who is behind this? How much funding they're getting? What is that contract? We would always, always, always have to know that about humanitarian organizations. When I was at the State Department, and the same is true of USAID. Granted, there is a lot of disruption right now with this administration and folding what's left of USAID into the State Department. But that does not excuse, we need transparency about this organization, who is behind it, how much money they're getting, what is, it's fundamental. It's fundamental to any administration. But like I said, if this administration is all about transparency and avoiding fraud, waste, and abuse, this seems to have all the hallmarks of that in spades. And I would also point out, Sarah mentioned the letter by 15 human rights organizations earlier, outlining concerns about how this operation is violating international humanitarian law. I would also recommend to everyone to look at the June 10th letter from Center for Constitutional Rights. It is a 15-page legal brief, including, footnotes about everything that we know or was known as of June 10th about this organization. And I highly recommend people read it, because it is a good summary of what is known and how that stacks up against basic international humanitarian law, and how this organization, even as of early June, was in violation of that. Over.
Thanks, Stacy. Sarah Lee, I think you were unmuting as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add in the important point that was made in the letter is that the employees of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation themselves face legal liability for aiding and abetting abuses. If they are knowingly allowing their aid distribution to be weaponized to harm civilians, which is exactly what we're seeing happening, they bear individual liability. And this would be an appropriate moment for the International Criminal Court, for example, as it has done in the Gaza case, as it has done in other ICC cases around the world, to remind these individuals that they face personal criminal liability and prosecution for facilitating war crimes and crimes against humanity. I think that would send a powerful message. It would really be useful for people involved in aid distribution like Stacy. I would love to know what former U.S. Aid Commissioner Samantha Power has to say about this. Perhaps she can make up for some of her own shortcomings while she was part of the Biden administration to chime in about the horrific weaponization of aid that we're seeing with this so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It would really be welcome to have people who have been involved in aid distribution vocally condemning this ploy. That is at least one form of public accountability.
Perfect. Thank you. Mohammed, anything from you on that point, or?
Well, I would say we need to first create the pressure that would lead towards accountability. The Israeli side is always better at this than us. So we organize protests or demonstrations, or we have very sort of articulate, loud voices with a just cause. But we're not organizing effectively. One way that you see with the pro-Israeli side is basically flooding public officials, elected officials, with phone calls and emails day in, day out, going to their offices day in and day out until they bow to pressure. I've seen some impact of this when it was tried in Europe, for example. So I was recently in Brussels, and Kaja Kallas, the EU foreign policy chief, one of her advisors was telling me that, yes, these emails have a very strong impact on us. They influence the mood, they influence our reading of the situation. And that's just one simple thing that can be done. To target public officials and elected officials very directly and make your voices heard of these concerns.
Perfect. Thank you, Mohammed. And on that point, kind of going to what Stacy said, if we can get more information on who is running the GHF, that could potentially maybe help, I would think, in terms of, being able to point to more specifics of its organization. I mean, we saw the executive director leave the organization the day before this started, right? He said it was not an impartial mechanism. That is not a small statement, right, from the person that was supposed to be operating the mechanism itself. I think we have Raed now, and so I want to welcome him into the conversation. Raed, I wanted to ask you just generally, what you're hearing kind of in U.S. policy circles, anything else you might want to add on GHF, just given in your capacity, obviously, as the advocacy director for Dawn.
There is some interest in the issue in DC. It's limited because I think Washington, DC has been overwhelmed with Israel's war on Iran, all of the updates that happened in the past couple of weeks leading up to that. There isn't a full understanding. There is confusion. There is, I think, most of our contacts in DC on the Hill are overwhelmed with the events in Gaza. But I would say two good things. The first one is there is a better understanding on how Israel has been deploying the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation for demographic engineering. So I've heard from many of my contacts and some voices in DC who follow the issue, understanding that this is not just about cutting aid. This is not just about shooting Palestinians who are standing in line. It's also about creating pull factors and demographic engineering to move Palestinians, ethnic cleansing by humanitarian aid. And that is a very, very important part. I think from the Senate side, we heard some very clear criticism to the points of distributions where Israel located the aid coming from and how this was strategically put to pull Palestinians out of northern Gaza and out of specific areas. I think the northern Gaza one is very clear. Israel placed the distribution site right below the Netzarim corridor, and then it's a one-way trip. Once you cross that checkpoint to get food, then the Israeli forces prevent you from going back to the northern neighborhoods in Gaza. It's a very, very clear tool of ethnic cleansing. Israel has used food as a weapon of war in the past couple of years, and this is one of the final stages where they have definitely been using war not just as a tool of starvation, but also a tool of ethnic cleansing, dropping bombs on areas as a push factor to push people out of those areas, and then putting food in areas as a pull factor to pull people into those areas. Definitely, it's a war crime, violation of all international treaties and norms and law when it comes to using food for these illegitimate genocidal goals. The other point that I want to say is I was actually very happy to hear about the Israeli government's announcement that they are going to shut down this operation. And for me, that is, number one, a proof to your question, Alex. Who is running the operation? Netanyahu is. I don't think there is any ambiguity here. Right? Anyone who can announce the end of an operation is the person who's running that operation. Who's running the operation? The Israeli government is running the operation. There is nothing independent about this foundation. It's a front of genocidal Israeli policies, and it's being exposed. Number two, I think the announcement saying that they have to stop it because Hamas took control over, that doesn't make any sense. From my reading, a few of the voices that I've heard familiar with the issue in Gaza, it seems like there is a very serious pressure coming on the Israeli government by the U.S., by other international partners to just stop this. People are just saying this is the end of this. We're not going to tolerate it anymore. There is pressure to hand over humanitarian aid to international agencies again. And then the way that the Netanyahu government are presenting this is by saying, oh, we have to stop the operation because of Hamas, blaming it on Hamas. So it sounds like a very pathetic PR stunt on the issue. Either way, I think I'm optimistic that this operation is coming to an end. Of course, I'm not very optimistic about the starvation that continues in Gaza. Our hope is that there is indeed pressure put on the Israeli government to not only end this genocidal ethnic cleansing system that they have installed, but to replace it with UNRWA and other legitimate UN agencies that have done this work for decades.
Wonderful. Thank you, Raed. I think actually perhaps we could also jump then maybe back to Mohammed, because you discussed, consultations with the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, for example. What are you hearing perhaps in the European capitals from European figures, just kind of continuation over from the US side?
Well, basically, GHF is there, as Sarah said very eloquently, they're there to bury evidence, destruction of evidence. That's one of their main functions. UN agencies that are delivering humanitarian aid in Gaza were basically the primary source of South Africa's genocide case at the ICJ. If you look at the footnotes, it's only UNRWA, UNDP, World Food Program, World Health Organization. They're not citing newspapers. They're not citing sort of speculative accounts. And Israel, if you want to bury down that evidence, you want to elbow out all those organizations out of Gaza. Israel's message to the EU is twofold. The first message is to tell European governments that the UN is inefficient, ineffective, and complicit with Hamas, that any aid you try to send into Gaza will not make it to the public there. It'll either end up not going into Gaza at all, or it will end up in the pockets of Hamas, both of which are false. And I've seen some European governments, for example, I saw a briefing recently where a European official is saying, we decided to stop sending aid to Gaza altogether, zero, none, and instead to send it to Sudan, because if we're going to try to send it and it won't make it to the people, so what's the point? And Israel's second message is to tell European governments, if you want to send aid to Gaza, GHF is the only entity that is capable of preventing hunger and starvation. So just there to maintain sort of a facade for the genocide to continue, to pretend that Israel is doing something about the starvation. And that message is actually quite powerful. It worked with some European officials. With Kaja Kallas herself, I think at some point she was caught by surprise at a conference, and she voiced some implicit support for GHF. The German foreign minister, he visited Israel, and they kept telling him one thing: looting, 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 Hamas looting, Hamas looting. And then he came out in the press conference and also voiced support for GHF. He said, if it's the only thing that can deliver food, maybe. And both of them had to apologize right after, because their own people, their own advisors told them there is criminal liability in this entity. This is an Israeli front organization. It's a sham. It's a proxy. You have Israel itself admitting it. I think Channel 11 was the one that said that GHF's funding is coming from the Israeli Ministry of Defense. You had the Israeli opposition leaders, Yair Lapid and Avigdor Lieberman, saying that the Mossad is the one that's funding this. Netanyahu is the only one that's funding this. But basically, like, to put the looting talking point to rest, and I've gone through that for months and months and months and investigated all of those claims. Recently, there was an article in Israel's national television, Channel 12, where an IDF source is saying we documented, quote, 100 cases of looting of aid in Gaza, and none, his verbatim quote, none, zero, were carried out by Hamas. They were all carried out by, quote, armed gangs, organized families, and disparate civilians. Armed gangs is the gangs that Israel is supporting, financing, providing equipment and cover for. They basically almost operate them with a remote control. The gang is just a front. If you've ever watched the Iron Man movie, they remind me always of that character that's called the Mandarin, the head of the Ten Rings terrorist organization that carries out all these fearsome executions on camera, until Iron Man goes and confronts him. And he's a failing British actor called Trevor Slattery that was hired as a front to maintain plausible deniability to the criminals behind him. And that's what you have with these gangs. They're like the leader of the gang is a guy that's about 1.5 meters tall, very tiny, very short, no muscle mass, no training, not even education. He dropped out of school in elementary school, a drug dealer convicted, spent about 8 years in prison, then escaped. So basically the gang leaders, the other ones as well, convicted murderers or convicted drug dealers or members of ISIS, Israel chose them because they're in the same predicament as Netanyahu, criminals on the run from authorities. As soon as the war ends, they have the same fate as Netanyahu, to end up on trial in prison possibly. So that's why Israel is using them as a front. That's why they're willing to collaborate, because their other option is prison. Otherwise, they're very sort of happy, willing agents. They don't have much options. And with the looting itself, like Israel's talking point is Hamas loots aid for what? They loot aid to buy weapons. From where? Walmart or Amazon. There's nothing that goes in or out of Gaza at the moment. So how are they going to buy weapons? It's Mike Huckabee's talking point. He said Hamas is looting aid to buy weapons. From where? And then the second talking point is that Hamas is looting aid to sell on the market to make money. And do what with the money? The only thing you can buy in Gaza right now is food. So sell food to buy more food. And then the other talking point is Hamas would use the aid to recruit new people. Do you think it takes this superficial level of commitment for a human being to hide in a tunnel for 20 months with basic rations, dates? Basically, Hamas militants, they would subsist on 3-4 dates a day, hide in a tunnel for months and months and months without any sunlight, without any air, and then go out to carry out ambushes against the IDF with the certain knowledge that they would be bombed immediately after, or they would be killed on the way. Is that a level of ideological commitment that can be established with a bag of wheat flour? But even if Hamas loots all the aid to give to its members, how many Hamas members are there? 30,000. How many people in Gaza? 2.4 million. It's like insane. You had Cindy McCain, you had David Satterfield, Biden's own humanitarian envoy, both saying Israel never even made a claim behind closed doors. They didn't even dare to make an allegation that Hamas was the one looting the aid. And the last point is that Israel has meticulous aerial surveillance over Gaza. Meticulous, inch by inch. It covers everything. It's multiple layers. There's satellite imagery. There is drone surveillance. There's quadcopter surveillance. There's American spy missions. There's British spy missions. And they couldn't provide a single picture, a single footage of Hamas looting aid until now. Is Hamas that good at it? And the last point, like, if Israel sees Hamas hijacking an aid truck, they can bomb it immediately. They've done this over and over and over again whenever volunteers tried to prevent those IDF-protected backed gangs from looting the aid. Then Israel would bomb them immediately. Each truck is fitted with a GPS. Each truck is basically monitored with a designated route. They're not allowed to deviate from that. Any deviation, they would be bombed immediately. The IDF decides which roads to drive on. If Hamas was to even attempt to divert a truck, they would be bombed on the spot. So it's insane, but it is paying off with Europeans. When I said these things word for word to people in Brussels, it was basically news to them. Like, for me, it was this moment of Don't Look Up, the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, to see the pure incompetence, the pure ignorance of governments with the largest bureaucracies, the largest intelligence services on the face of the planet, that they didn't even know who Yasser Abu Shabab was. They didn't even know who David Satterfield was. They didn't hear Cindy McCain's statement. They only heard the phone calls they keep getting from Gideon Saar and Israel Katz and Netanyahu. It's insane. And that's the thing about Europeans. There's this level of pathetic cowardice, deliberate ignorance. They want to not know. They want to remain ignorant in order to maintain plausible deniability. The recent show of strength that you show rhetorical statements coming out of Europe about, we're concerned about starvation or this or that. Their own diplomats, their own advisors, their own civil servants kept telling me behind closed doors, this is all fraud. This is all a sham. These are maneuvers, PR stunts to grab headlines while continuing to support, to aid, to finance the very genocide that they claim to oppose. At some point, I conclude with this, at some point there was a European senior official that told me even their talking points, their public statements were coming out of Tel Aviv. And then I looked with bewilderment, and she added, she said, I protested. I said, we have our own foreign service. We have our own experts. We have our own reporters, desk officers. Why are they not drafting our own talking points? And then she added to it verbatim. She said, if I speak up, I will never have a job again. And that's the level of fear that you have. Like in Germany, I was there a couple of days ago, 80% of the population oppose Israel's actions and want a suspension of weapons to Israel. 100% of the government support Israel's quote right to defend itself, to carry a genocide.
Thanks, Mohammed. That just very powerful. That was excellent. I mean, it's frustrating in the end of the day. Almost a, like you said, almost a willfulness, right? That should be unacceptable. I want to call on Sarah Dill, who has her hand up. Should be able to unmute and go ahead.
Great, thank you. Am I coming through clear?
Yep.
Okay, great. So just as a heads up, we were hoping that it would be out by the time this Zoom happened, but BBC has been working on a major piece investigating GHF. This has been going on for probably 2.5 months now. It will be coming out, I believe, within the hour. And what it really focused on was investigating the killings that were happening and focusing about, as Sarah Lee went into very well, the liability, both for the Israeli government, which already has the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant on starvation, but also for GHF and how their involvement in this could place liability squarely on their heads for complicity in war crimes. But also how Israel's obligations as an occupying power, and not only have they breached their obligations to provide aid and food and everything that the population of Gaza needs, but that they are further, as all of you have talked about, that they've created this death trap where they have starved the people, they've made them desperate, and then they're not allowing safe passage to these grossly inadequate sites to provide aid. And that it's a dissuasion for people. It's a fear for them. It's psychological torture that those who are going to get aid are now risking death and or arrest. And given Israel's history in arbitrary detention, so this piece should be coming out within the hour. And so we'll share the link as soon as I have it. But we really delved into the liability, making calls for accountability, for sanctions, for the international community to act, and to put the provision of aid back in the hands of UNRWA and others who can actually effectively, so long as Israel allows them to operate, get aid into Gaza and to the people who need it, but most importantly, to end this ongoing genocide.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. And I'm sure all of us would be fascinated to read that once it comes out. So please do share. And it kind of, speaks to this idea, I think, of raising awareness, building up the accountability components we were just talking about. Raed, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. This was a good update. And I do think, just like to reiterate the angle of liability, like this kind of evidence is exceptionally important for us here in the U.S. because it might open a pathway of civil lawsuits against this, any U.S. security contractors involved in killing of Palestinians. If there's any evidence there for U.S. involvement, U.S. security contractors opening fire, U.S. security contractors engaging in any of these genocidal acts. So it not only it's important for accountability reasons and for international legal mechanisms. I think for us here in the U.S., it might actually open the door to hold some of these companies and individuals with U.S. anchor accountable through our legal system.
Thanks, Raed. I don't know if other panelists have anything to add.
I can say, this is Stacy. There are, since this war in Gaza began, there have been lawsuits by American citizens who were injured or killed as a result of Israel dropping U.S. weapons on them. So there are a number of lawsuits that are pending. Over.
Thank you, Stacy. Going back to the Q&A, we have one participant who has a general question about advocacy. They work for an organization providing medical care in Gaza. I want to just ask them to pose their question to the group. So I'm going to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi. Yeah, so I run a medical organization in Gaza that involves sending international delegates into the hospitals, and we also run a field clinic. And my staff are treating the victims of these massacres. And the organization itself, the head office is in Canada. We've been doing our best in terms of advocating to our own government, in terms of trying to, raise awareness to the general public about these atrocities. But we're at a loss, right? Like many of the people on this call, we've been pleading for this genocide to stop. And so my question was to the group, do you have any suggestions based on the fact that we have direct access to these victims? Do you have any suggestions on what we can do to amplify their voices, to make people better informed about what's happening, and hopefully encourage them, to go back to one of the speaker's comments, to be on the phone with government representatives and demanding that this stop? So really, that's the question. Any suggestions at all? I'd be happy to hear them.
Whoever would like to take it, please. Go ahead, Mohammed. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. I would say that, as you said, and as I mentioned earlier, try to reach to government officials directly. The higher up they are in government, the better it is. Basically, Joseph Borrell, Kaja Kallas's predecessor, the EU foreign policy and security policy chief, basically his own people were withholding the briefings that are coming from the EU embassy in Jerusalem, the EU mission to Palestine. I learned it from a number of European diplomats. They said the briefings, the information was being withheld from him actively. There is this sort of interest within the machinery to maintain ignorance. So a European Union leader, he told me that basically he printed UN reports as they are and tried to give it to European heads of states. The majority of them refused to even take UN reports. They said, nah, the UN is biased, the UN is infiltrated, the UN cannot be trusted. They wanted to remain ignorant. And the more that you try to break that shield of ignorance, the better it is, especially in terms of criminal liability. You have a person like Mark Rutte, the Netherlands prime minister at the time, and now the head of NATO, who's calling Trump daddy. He basically, when he was prime minister, he was asking his own people, how do we make it sound in the official paperwork that what Israel is doing in Gaza is not war crimey? Literally, he's saying, like, try to spin it so that in the paperwork, there is no paper trail, there's no evidence of prior knowledge, of mens rea, of sort of a guilty mind in the complicity that they didn't know, basically, and trying to break that as much as possible. Israel tries to do that through a number of ways. For example, survivors of October 7th, previous hostages, touring them around government offices wherever they could, organizing trips to government offices wherever they could, and identifying links of potential influence. And it's very laughable what Israel tries to push with those individuals. At some point, Israel's narrative was, there is one of the hostages, unnamed, said that he was held by an UNRWA, United Nations school teacher. So that alleged school teacher, his first thought after kidnapping an Israeli was to give him his UNRWA ID card and say, look, I'm an UNRWA employee. Go and expose me as soon as you leave from here. You had then Israel getting Emily Damari to come out and say, I was held in an UNRWA school in northern Gaza, and conveying that in a letter, in a written note to the Prime Minister of the UK. It's insane. Israel systematically emptied out northern Gaza of any UNRWA employees. So even if, although there is no substantiation, even if Damari was held in a school, it was not functioning as an UNRWA facility. It's an abandoned facility. Israel has been using UNRWA schools to park IDF tanks, to hide soldiers, to carry out attacks from these United Nations facilities. And at some point, it went even more crazy. There was an Israeli government claim that one of the hostages, quote, said that his Hamas captors told him that they were financing and providing instructions to the student encampments at Columbia University. If you try to tell the average Hamas member the word Columbia, the only thing that would cross their minds is Pablo Escobar. Nobody heard of it in Gaza. And to make a claim that's so lunatic, so bizarre, and then to see it amplified by government officials. So try to break that cycle as much as possible by platforming victims themselves. Recently in Brussels, Kaya Kalas, her own advisors are telling me she's never been to the Middle East. She's trying to learn. She's never visited it even before her position. And her first trip was the one to Israel. And on that trip, as soon as the Israelis took her to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, her message was, quote, victims are making victims. Victims have become victimizers. That's her first impression, something that the Israelis did not expect her to come out with. But there is some room for potential there. Try to flood them with as many calls, as many requests for meetings as possible. Break that plausible deniability.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mohammed. Anyone else on that question before we go to the next?
This is Stacy. It's an excellent question. Who is collecting this information? And I would, in the past, the U.S. had an office that collected this, but I would not, I don't think they even exist anymore. But I would say absolutely collect and document everything. And rather than handing it over to, I would say actually UN High Commission for Human Rights would be a collector of this information, but that's a long process. And to the extent that more and more countries take this up and more people see what's happening, that's the best way to try to make the tide turn on this. And I have to believe the tide is turning. I have to believe that, because I don't think any one of us could wake up in the morning if you don't think that there's hope to make this change. So maybe reach out to South Africa, reach out to other countries that, I know Israel at this point would say, oh, South Africa, they have it in for us, or High Commissioner for Human Rights has it in for us. The more you can reach out to other countries, to Norway, to others, to say, please look at this. Please do something. It's what we call in the United States a full court press. And that is incumbent on all of us to continue to do at home and abroad. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Stacy. If no other additions to that question, I'm going to allow another participant to speak now. We have two hands up, so just bear with us as we get through them. Omar, you can go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Omar Dan. I'm actually a human rights expert in the Middle East region. I come from Jerusalem, actually. And I've been working with Amnesty International and other human rights groups, documenting human rights violations and war crimes in Gaza. We've been actually working on submitting a case or different cases for the ICC, ICJ, and other universal jurisdictions. And I guess, first of all, I would like to invite you all to participate. We are a group of independent human rights scholars, UN agencies, human rights organizations like Al-Haq, even Francesca Albanese is part of the campaign. I think the debate here that I've heard, and apologies, I've only joined half an hour after the discussion started, is only focused on the U.S. and it's a lost case actually. Whatever you will try, you'll have lots of power over the whole system, and it will push back any kind of legal jurisdiction. And I guess if you want really to win a case, at least, we need to focus on the real perpetrators, which is the state of Israel and its leadership. And in that front, I really invite you all. I've shared a couple of strategic documents on the Q&A, including the ICC filing. I would hope that you will have the chance to look at it. And at any time, I don't want to take too much time debating this, but at any time we do have a meeting, the next strategy session would be this Saturday at 12:30 Jerusalem time. I would invite you all who have legal background, including Raed. I know Raed have a strong legal background. If you'd like to join us in this kind of global campaign for action, which would really focus on the protection of journalists and, going through the ICC, ICJ, international jurisdictions, including in the EU. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Omar. Okay, I believe the other hand up was not intended to be up, and so what I want to do is just jump over to some closing statements here. We've covered a wide range of issues related to GHF and humanitarianism, in Gaza, but I just want to leave everyone with, maybe 2 minutes each, just quick closing statements. Mohammed, do you mind if we start with you? Is that okay?
Let's start it the other way around.
Okay, so Raed then. Sorry.
No, let's start it the other way around again. Well, I appreciate all of the notes by all of the speakers and the participants. I think for me, the two biggest takeaway points are these. Number one,
Sorry.
the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is nothing more than a tool, an Israeli government tool for death and destruction and genocide. This is a front of a genocidal apartheid regime that has been used to kill and maim Palestinians and push them out of their homes. I think this is crystal clear as we stand now. And I hope everyone on the call has no ambiguity about who's behind it or what are the intentions or whether or not this is an efficient way to replace the legitimate international mechanisms such as UNRWA. The other point I want to say, Alex, is that, accountability, that is something that we should always be focusing on. Hopefully now with the demise of the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, we can work on systems of accountability. I will definitely watch the documentary that Sarah Elizabeth Dill mentioned on the call on the BBC, find some openings for us to take legal action and hold all criminals who participated in this scheme accountable, even after it ends.
Wonderful. Thank you, Raed. Over to you, Stacy.
Yeah, I agree with Raed said. I would say also continuing to demand accountability from our own government about who is behind, where is the funding coming from, and just continuing to hold our government officials accountable for that. This should not be, it says a lot to me as a former government official that there is so little information about this. But I would say also, as this organization continues to seek staffing, that people need to be aware of that. Like, they are apparently leaning very heavily on people who used to do humanitarian assistance very well in the U.S. government, people who used to have jobs at USAID, and they've been reaching out to them to provide staffing for this. And those people should know very well what is being asked of them and think very, very long and hard should they join that operation. But in the past, before this operation began, I described it as a stunt. Like previous operations, the floating pier, the large, expensive, disastrous floating pier, the airdrops, it was a stunt, but this has become deadly. When this is proving to be just as deadly as IDF airstrikes, it's no longer a stunt. It is, it's something far, far more dangerous. And we need to keep that in mind as this goes forward. Over.
Thanks, Stacy. I love the connection to the peer. I think it's one that is a strong connection and should not be understated by any means. Okay, Mohammed, over to you. Actually, excuse me. Sorry, Sarah Lee first. Sorry.
Hi there. My Wi-Fi is weak, so I will just make three observations. In terms of the comments about accountability and questions accountability and holding our own government, in our case, the U.S. government accountable, I just want to mention and remind folks that Dawn is currently in litigation with the U.S. State Department for its failure to enforce the Leahy law restricting military assistance to abusive units of foreign security forces, a law they have never imposed or enforced with respect to Israel. And we hope to be in judicially ordered discussions with the government in due course. So we're hopeful that that will be an additional point of leverage that is now supported as well by a number of senators who've asked the General Accounting Office of the U.S. government to investigate the State Department's failure to enforce the Leahy laws. So these are important nodes of pressure that we're seeking, as well as the ICC submission that Dawn made against Biden administration officials, President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, Secretary of Defense Austin, as well as, I believe, 9 Biden administration officials whom we identified meriting further investigation for aiding and abetting war crimes in Gaza. And that is an effort that we are making, even though it's become politically challenging, even legally challenging in the United States to make such submissions to the International Criminal Court. Second, I would say, is with respect to information. We are in now an information war because it's really the last thing standing between Israel and completely securing its genocide, right? They have tried to impede the legal means of resistance, like the cases at the ICC and the ICJ. They have tried to stymie populations throughout the United States and the West from protesting Israeli actions. And one of the last nodes of permissible investigation, review, and commentary, because there are no journalists in Gaza, are the humanitarian organizations. So I think that the efforts to substitute legitimate humanitarian organizations with this controlled one is part of the war, and it's the war against information. Finally, I would just say that humanitarian aid writ large around the globe is one of the few standing pillars of independent accountability for government actions, for government behaviors. The law is not serving us, certainly not as quickly as it should. Our own rights to speech are being punished and stymied. And so around the world, humanitarian aid and humanitarian aid organizations are such key pillars of telling us what's actually happening around the world. And so what I see happening in Gaza is what I fear is going to be used to dismantle humanitarian aid organizations worldwide.
Thank you, Sarah Lee, and well said. So finally, Mohammed.
Thanks so much. So I'd say Israel's goal has been and still remains basically the destruction of a group called Palestinians. What the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic Studies in Israel was basically saying, detaching Palestinians from Palestine, from the land that they know as their homeland. And it's been Israel's goal from time immemorial. The strategy that we see now is just an acceleration of it. So if you look 1967, Israel's labor defense minister Moshe Alon was saying, we will tell Palestinians we have no solution. Whoever wants to stay here shall live like dogs, otherwise they should leave. And the strategy was keep their lives as miserable as possible. Now what you see is no longer keeping their lives miserable. It's basically engineering a population collapse from within. GHF, the gangs, all of the things that we talked about are part and parcel of this strategy to destroy a group from the inside. So that as soon as the bombardment, the war is over, people would leave out of their own accord to survive. There would no longer be something called Gaza because Israel would not allow reconstruction, and the only option to survive would be to leave, to go out. That's why you have the Israeli prime minister saying that even if Hamas disarms, surrenders, hands over the hostages, leaves Gaza, we would still occupy Gaza and implement what he calls the Trump plan, depopulating and emptying out the entire place. And the best way to fight back against this is basically don't let Gaza fade away. European statements that recently came out, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand as well, Norway, European Union member states, it did not come out of the goodness of their hearts. I'm very well and aware of what goes behind the scenes. It came out of an expectation that failed. They expected Gaza to die out, to fade away. It didn't. You saw demonstrations in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, of up to 100,000 pro-Palestinians about a month ago. It's the same in Italy and other places. And the other element is that Israel's genocide has become so clear, so stated as a matter of fact, that they couldn't spin it. It's not like Gantz and Gallant and Netanyahu didn't make genocidal statements at the onset of the genocide, but back then they could have been explained away by those European leaders as something like, they were too angry, they were traumatized, they were shocked, or these statements are polemics, they are for internal consumption. But now the genocidal statements are becoming very specific with very clear legal consequences. We will starve the population. We will bomb the food warehouses. We will bomb the hospitals. That there is no room for maneuver. And it is precisely of the continued pressure that those governments spoke up. And they spoke up to maneuver, to sort of subdue, to suppress the sympathy or the pressure to act by pretending that they're acting. So try to keep it up as much as possible. And don't underestimate the power of engaging with officials directly. As I said, Kaya Kalas, the EU foreign policy chief, when she was in Ramallah, in Palestine recently, on her first ever visit to the Middle East, she comes from Estonia, so the only thing she knows is Russia, 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 Russia. So first visit to Ramallah, she meets with her staff, the EU diplomatic mission, with the Palestinian staff there, and they give her a long talk for 45 minutes that kept her head spinning the whole way back, because she's never been exposed to that very personal, very direct confrontation. Like if you look at Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, there's an article in Politico, something like "All Hail Queen Ursula," if I remember the headline correctly. She lives a very insulated life on purpose. She lives on the 13th floor of the EU Commission official building. She literally turned the 13th floor into a penthouse, so she wouldn't interact with any human beings, aside from the choreographed, the well-staged, manufactured appearances that she makes. She doesn't talk to journalists. She doesn't meet with virtually any groups on a systematic basis. So those kinds of leaders are deliberately trying to maintain ignorance, to maintain plausible deniability, try to break it as much as possible, ask for meetings with elected officials, public officials, and if they refuse, organize meetings particularly for Gazan victims, if you could, as the point was raised earlier. And if they refuse, name and shame them. Say this public official, this member of Congress, is refusing to meet with Palestinian victims of genocide. This is the only way forward, to maintain the pressure until they bow down. A change is always very slow until it's not. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mohammed. And thank you to all of our panelists. This was an excellent event. Really can't thank everyone enough for their contributions on this really, really important issue. We did put a number of the resources that were discussed during this event into the chat. So if you go in there, you'll see the Dawn ICC submission, some of the other CCR submissions that we discussed earlier. Highly recommend going into those. And yes, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our panel for their contributions. We hope to see everyone for a future event here. Dawn.